You might have seen an earlier video where I demonstrated a Yaesu FRG-7 receiver. This was one of the most popular receivers of the late 1970s and early 1980s. Many people got their first taste of having a really good receiver via the FRG-7. Much of the secret of its performance is due to the Wadley Loop that's used in its circuit. Enough of the preamble. Now onto a spreadsheet to illustrate how the Wadley Loop gets its magic. There are other videos that describe how the Yaesu FRG-7 works, and I'd recommend having a look at some of them, particularly one by W2AEW. In this video, I'll take a different approach. It came about when I got my Yaesu FRG-7, downloaded the instruction manual and tried to get my head around the Wadley Loop system. Now, if we take a look at the block diagram for the receiver, here it is. A lot of stages, a lot of mixers, and it all looks quite complicated. Now, when you are confronted with a complicated block diagram, first step is to break it down into stages, including those that you can understand. Right here near the antenna, you've got the attenuator, RF amplifier. There's also a front-end bandpass filter. This filter is controlled by the band switch that you see on the bottom left of the FRG-7's front panel. There's 4 positions, broadcast band and 3 shortwave. And you've also got the pre-selector, which is the top left control, and you adjust that for a peak in the signal levels. And so if you need to change frequency more than a few hundred kilohertz, then you do need to adjust that pre-selector. So that's pretty straightforward. I'm going to assume that you understand that. Now, if we look at the back end of the receiver, it's a conventional superhet audio amplifier. If you work back, there's detector stages. The IF stage, the last IF is at 455 kilohertz. There's a ceramic filter here to provide some selectivity. A conventional VFO, that goes from 2.455 to 3.455. So right here, it's a superhet receiver. Very, very ordinary. The incoming signal is 3 to 2 megahertz. The reason why it's written backwards is the mixing process. You are taking the difference between the VFO frequency and the incoming signal here. The VFO frequency is actually higher than the incoming signal, so you're subtracting the incoming signal, but your difference is always 455 kilohertz for the intermediate frequency, where it's then detected and demodulated and amplified. So right here, the back end of the receiver is just a very ordinary single conversion receiver that covers a 1 megahertz range from 3 to 2 megahertz. And the backward tuning actually has some advantages in it reduces the number of spurious signals. I won't go into that into too much detail, but yeah, having the VFO at a higher frequency than your incoming signal does have some advantages in receiver design. And this VFO is free running, but at this sort of low frequency, around 3 megahertz, it's quite easy to build one so it's quite frequency stable. So, yep, that's the back end of the FRG-7. What is most of interest, and what I'll describe in most detail, is all this circuitry around here. There's quite a few stages. There are 3 mixer stages, there are some oscillator stages, and some RF filter stages. And it's not a phase lock loop, but it's what's called a Wadley loop, and the principle of a loop type architecture is that a signal can drift, but the process, there's a feedback process so that that drift is cancelled. and the drift doesn't appear. And that's important because the first local oscillator in the FRG-7 is a really high frequency. It's actually VHF. It's 55.5 to 85.5 megahertz, and that's a free running oscillator with just an ordinary variable capacitor. And if you were to have that sort of oscillator, that would drift a lot. It would definitely drift so much that you wouldn't be able to receive SSB easily. But with this mixing arrangement, because you are subtracting and adding frequencies at different parts of the diagram and you're recombining them, you're actually providing a bit of cancelling out of that, so you don't actually notice that drift and the result is perfectly stable. So that's a quick overview of the Wadley Loop. And a bit of a history. I think it was first used in the 1950s on a professional receiver, a Racal receiver. Then in about 1970 there was a Barlow Wadley type portable receiver that used it. It was expensive but good for its time and provided a communication receiver type performance. Then from the mid-70s you had the Drake SSR1 and the Yaesu FRG-7, and the latter in particular was very, very popular. It gave many shortwave listeners their first really good performance communications receiver. In fact, it was pretty much a communications receiver, but for consumer, amateurs, and a bit more than casual type users. And one of the benefits of that is things like frequency display, because all your frequencies could be tuned with your 1 megahertz band. The FRG-7 is basically 30 odd bands of 1 megahertz wide. You had your main dial, it only tuned 1 megahertz, so you had frequency markings of every 10 kilohertz, and so you could estimate frequencies to within, say, 3 or 4 kilohertz quite well on the main dial. And that's not great by today's standards, where we expect frequency readouts to the nearest 10 kilohertz, 100 kilohertz or better. But for the 1970s, that was a big breakthrough, because before then, a lot of receivers, 1 megahertz might have only been a centimetre on the dial, and it was really hard to know what frequency you were tuned to. So with the FRG-7, because it brought all frequencies down to a lower range, you had a big dial and you could easily read the frequency. So that was great. The other thing that's good is the drift cancelling, which meant that you had stable reception of signals, even if you're receiving SSB. And again, that was something that wasn't the norm for 1970s type receivers. If you had something like a Tandy Realistic DX160, for instance, it was fine for the broadcast band and the lower frequency amateur bands, but for higher bands like 21 megahertz, 28 megahertz, it drifted quite a bit. So you had to retune the receiver for SSB. So they were the problems that the Wadley Loop, like used in the FRG-7, overcame. And it was very, very ingenious. And remember, this was the days well before DDS VFOs, and even crystals were quite expensive to provide in receiver. There were some receivers that had a lot of crystal controlled front end, but they were generally for select bands. And the FRG-7 didn't have that, but it could provide a general coverage type performance. So that's some background. What I've done with this spreadsheet is I've got some boxes. There are 3 of them where I've just got frequencies that you enter. There's no formulas in them. Most of the other frequencies, though, actually have formulas. You can just see here. And these formulas are just sum and difference. They're very, very simple. Oh, there's one here that's a multiplication. But apart from that, we're not talking about calculus. This is very simple, adding and subtracting frequencies. Now, you have to understand the idea of a mixer circuit. mixer circuit, you've got two incoming frequencies. I've got some arrows here so you can follow where the input and output frequencies are. This one here, for instance, you've got 4 megahertz coming in one input, 56.5 megahertz coming out. With a mixer, you have two outputs. One is the sum of the inputs, the other is the difference of the inputs. And you normally only need to use one. And to make sure that you only get one, then you have bandpass filters. And the FRG-7 does have bandpass filters. There's one at the front end, which is the pre-selector, but you've also got two in the VHF range. And so yeah, they're just capacitors and inductors, several stages of them, because you need quite a narrow bandpass filter. So incoming signal through here. For our first example, we'll use 1.6 megahertz. Now, with a loop, one of the hard things about explaining it is where to start. So we'll talk about some of the oscillators involved. Right here, there is a 1 megahertz frequency. That's where the FRG-7's only crystal is. It's a crystal on 1 megahertz. Up here is a harmonic generator that generates lots of harmonics. So you've got outputs of 1 megahertz, 2 megahertz, 3, 4 megahertz, so forth, up to about 33 or 34 megahertz, something like that. So that is one of the inputs into this mixer that I've called a pre-mix. The other thing here is we've got an oscillator. I should mention that I've got color codings of the various stages. The mixers are shown in yellow. The bandpass filters are shown in green. There are 3 mixers, by the way, 3 bandpass filters. The oscillators are shown in blue. There's 2 oscillators. There's the 1 megahertz crystal controlled reference oscillator that I mentioned before. And there's also a free running oscillator that goes from 55.5 to 84.5. So that's a 30 megahertz range in the VHF range. And it's free running, just used as a coil and a variable capacitor, which, as I mentioned before, that would drift quite a lot, except for this ingenious Wadley Loop mixing arrangement. The other thing I've got as a separate stage is this harmonic generator that I've already spoken about. So yeah, getting back to the circuit description, we've got 4 megahertz coming in here. We've got the oscillator here at 56.5 megahertz. I've got a table here, and later on I will tune with this spreadsheet the FRG-7, and you can see how the different frequencies vary. Anyway, here for 1.6 megahertz, we actually want to tune the 1 to 2 megahertz segment. So for that, we need 56.5 selected here on the band. So you've got 56.5 coming out here, mixing with our 4 megahertz. Now, in practice, there's a lot more frequencies other than 4 megahertz coming out. But anyway, if we take 4 megahertz, which is our desired harmonic, difference 56.5 minus 4, 52.5. You've also got 56.5 plus 4, which is 60.5. But as we're putting it right through this bandpass filter, we are rejecting that 60.5 megahertz signal. So right here, in fact, I should probably write 60.5. In fact, I should be a bit smarter than that, because I've got in the spreadsheet an equation there. This 52.5 equals this minus 4. So let us put in a formula equals that 56.5 plus here. So yeah, 60.5 right there. Now that is the sum. So you've actually got two undesired, or two frequencies here, 52.5 and 60.5. And let us just put that in grey, maybe. Anyway, coming out of this filter, it only accepts the 52.5, and we've just got arrows, so we've got 52.5 present at one of the inputs to the second mixer. So hold that thought for a while. Now, while the pointer is at the back end of the receiver, just think of this tunable IF as a 2 to 3 megahertz tunable receiver. Don't need to talk much more about that. Meanwhile, we've got another output from this band selecting VFO. Exactly the same, 56.5 megahertz. And now here, our receive frequency, what I've done is I've also got the receive frequency as a formula. I've set this spreadsheet up so that if you adjust certain frequencies, they're the ones that are user adjustable, notably the band here and the tunable IF. And I've taken some liberties with the harmonic generator. Then you get the receive frequency, as I'll demonstrate later. So this spreadsheet actually simulates a tunable FRG-7 receiver. Anyway, our desired frequency here is 1.6 megahertz. We've set the bandpass filter up to it. And if we take the output of this is another mixer, so we've got an input at 1.6 megahertz, another input at 56.5. Now the difference between them is 54.9. Now again, this mixer has two outputs. There's the difference as well as the sum, so I really ought to do the same thing as I did before, that plus that there, 58.1, and that is our undesired output from the mixer. But it is completely irrelevant to how this receiver operates, because right here we've got our 55 megahertz bandpass filter. This has a bandwidth of 1 megahertz, so 54.9 is fine. It passes through without any attenuation because the filter's been designed to pass 54.5 to 55.5. So we've got present at the second mixer 54.9, 52.5. Again, you've got a sum and difference thing. The sum is, let's put that in, that plus that, and it's going to be above 100 megahertz, 107.4 megahertz. Now, if you wanted to receive wideband FM on an FRG-7, arguably you could tap into your innards of the receiver and hold a FM receiver up to the FRG-7. You'd probably need a physical connection to the antenna, and you could actually use an FM broadcast receiver as a tunable IF. But that's wideband FM. You don't get that on HF, so that's just a curiosity. Anyway, what we've got here, the desired output, it's 2.4 megahertz, and that goes into our tunable IF, which is just a straight single conversion SUPET receiver. And that tunable IF has a product detector, BFO, so you can receive SSB on it. And I've just got this, because you vary this with the main tuning knob of the FRG-7, I've just put in 2.4 megahertz. Now, there's no formula attached to that, so let us simulate what happens when we adjust the main tuning dial. Have a look at the spreadsheet and you'll see that some frequencies change. So let us move it by 1 kilohertz. So let us type in 2.5, and our receive frequency has changed. We are now receiving 1.5 megahertz. The other interesting thing is that the frequency up here has changed because instead of a different frequency, we're at 56.5, so 1.5 and 56.5. The difference is 55 megahertz. That's still well within the center frequency of the bandpass filter, so that's fine, that's passed unattenuated. That mixes with 52.5 megahertz, and we've got 2.5 megahertz there, so that's still audible on our tunable IF, right in the middle of the range. So the dial of the FRG-7 would be on 500. Now, the really interesting thing is, I'll change the frequency again, have a look at what happens around here. I'll go back to 2.6. This frequency stays at 52.5 megahertz all the time. And we'll do some other frequencies and you'll notice a similar effect. And you're still mixing with our 4 megahertz. That remains at 56.5. So yeah, this 56.5 remains constant. Even if we change back to 2.5 or 2.1, that stays the same. At 2.1, we're up to 1.9 megahertz. Now, with the FRG-7, the front-end bandpass filter, which has the 4-position switch, that is independent of the rest of the receiver. So for an incoming signal of 1.9 megahertz, you actually need to switch up to, I think it's 1.6 to 4 megahertz in the front end, and you need to re-peak. It's the manual control, the bandpass filter. But once you've done that, it's all good. So we'll go back to our 1.6 megahertz. Now, let us supposing, I mentioned here, this oscillator is free running. Let's say it drifts a bit. You could have a drift of 100 kilohertz. That would not be unusual for a VHF free running oscillator. And if you had that with a normal local oscillator on a receiver, then you'd be way off frequency. And it would be, you might tune back and then it would drift again. But let's have a look at what happens here. Let us say it drifts to 56.6, so 100 kilohertz off. Yep, the frequency here has changed, 55. But notice how we've still got the 2.4 megahertz. That's the tunable IF. That's actually independently adjusted, so as you'd expect, that wouldn't change. But let's look at our receive frequency. It is still on 1.6 megahertz. So although this oscillator here, the free running oscillator at VHF, the band select oscillator, that is drifted by 100 kilohertz, but there's been no drift at all to the receive frequency. Amazing. This is the secret behind the Wadley Loop. The thing is though that this 55, this frequency changed a little bit, and unusually this frequency down here changed as well. It went from 52.5 to 52.6, but because we're adding up here and subtracting here, it all cancels out. Our drift here cancels out, so we remain with the good frequency stability. We'll go back to 56.5, and this could drift by quite a bit. Let us have a even bigger drift. Let's say it drifts by 1 whole megahertz, 57.5. Now, 1 whole megahertz, 55.9. Now, okay, we've got a bit of a problem here, because if this is 1 megahertz bandwidth, this is only accepting a frequency of, let's say 54.5 to 55.5. 55.9 is actually a bit outside our 1 megahertz bandwidth, assuming it's centered on 55. If it was 55.5, it would probably be okay. If we have a look here, we've got a similar issue here, 53.5. That is a bit away from our 1 megahertz. So you might actually still hear signals. In fact, you'd still be spot on frequency because it's still 1.6 megahertz here. But you'll notice you're at past the edge of the bandpass filter. So unless the signal was really strong, you probably wouldn't hear it. So there is a bit of a limit to how much this can drift without you losing the signal. But if the signal's strong enough, you'll still hear it. So you'll just peak this control again. Let's put it back to 56.5, and you've got your passband here, your signal here, pretty close to the middle of the passband of that filter. Same here with 52.5, and it's fine again. Now let us suppose we want to tune to another band. Well, let's say we want the 14 megahertz amateur band. I've just made this lookup table here. I really strongly suggest, if you want to understand how the Wadley Loop works, you make your own spreadsheet, including putting in your own formulas. In fact, it's probably a good exercise to actually reverse engineer, try to do what I did, and look at how the formulas worked, putting in your own formulas rather than make this spreadsheet available. Anyway, let's say we want to tune 14 megahertz. Well, we need to adjust this band switch. This is one of the roller dials that you tune from 0 to 30 megahertz. You're adjusting this free-running oscillator on VHF. I've already done the sums. Anyway, you want it to be 69.5 megahertz. Whoops, wrong spot. Let's put it here, 69.5. Now, you've still got your receive frequency here at 1.6 megahertz. You haven't adjusted the tunable IF. And theoretically, if your signal on 1.6 megahertz was strong enough, it could bash through all this and you might still hear it. However, in practice, you're not going to hear it because our frequencies here are so wildly different from our bandpass filter. 67.9 megahertz. The filter here is centered on 55. Same deal with this frequency down here, 65.5 and 52.5. So, yep, it's not going to get through. However, we'll pick off another harmonic. This is not actually a manual selection. I've got it as a manual selection in this spreadsheet, but in practice, I think there's lots of harmonics. They all appear simultaneously at 1 megahertz intervals, but because this filter is so sharp, it doesn't matter. It effectively only picks the right one. Anyway, 14 megahertz, we want the harmonic that's at 17 megahertz right here. And okay, we're pretty good. We're fairly close to frequency, but we wanted 14.2, so we need to adjust our tunable IF. So a few cranks of the main tuning knob. Let's try 2.8. That's fine because it's in our 2 to 3 megahertz range. And right now we're on 14.2 megahertz. And this receiver is going to work. It's going to be sensitive because 55.3 is near enough to our center of the filter at 55. Same down here, this is 52.5, so that's spot on. So we've now adjusted the FRG-7 to 14.2 megahertz, and we've done it by adjusting our tunable IF. We've picked off the right harmonic generator. That's done automatically. We've adjusted the band. Now, you still won't receive any signals on it until you manually adjust the pre-selector here at the front end. So you need to adjust your 4-position band switch and then tune for maximum noise on the other roller dial where you just tune it to near 14, 15 megahertz. And you'll hear a big increase in noise and you'll be able to tune signals adjusting your tunable IF here. So that is a quick look at the Wadley Loop as implemented on the Yaesu FRG-7. I know other people have done videos on this, but I thought that this is a different way of explaining it. It might be helpful to some people, and I really strongly suggest that you get the instruction manual. You can find it on the web. Have a look at the block diagram. If you're stuck, read the circuit description, and most important of all, make up a spreadsheet like that. It's just in Excel. I've just used arrows to show the signal paths, and you can color code your stages for the different stages of the receiver. If you want, you might want to simulate things like images and possible spurious responses, that sort of thing. But yeah, I've just stuck to the basics of how the FRG-7 works and the Wadley Loop. I'm sure there's other variations of the Wadley Loop. You might even be able to use it for a transmitter possibly, although it's pretty much old technology. You can do this sort of stuff that the Wadley Loop sought to do much cheaper and much simpler with DDS type VFOs like the SI 5351 and the Arduino, etc. You've got much better frequency stability on a tiny board that costs a fraction of the cost that the Wadley Loop and all its stages and filters did in its day. And when you look at the inside of an FRG-7, all those tuned circuits, all the alignment, and if you want to align an FRG-7, it is a major task. There are just all these bandpass filters, all these oscillators, and if they're not right, then you can very easily stuff it up, especially if you use a wrong screwdriver and break some of the adjustable coils and all that. So yeah, I haven't touched my FRG-7. It gives good performance, so I think I'll leave it there. But yeah, have a look at the block diagram, make up a spreadsheet, not only with this, maybe other receivers you want to understand their frequency conversions, and I think this is a really powerful tool for understanding how receivers work, and you can even do it with transceivers as well. So hope you enjoyed this, and don't forget to leave your comments if there's anything I've missed or there's other ways that you have found useful in learning how to understand Wadley loops.